Calling the meeting to order of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, 42nd Parliament. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, October the 4th, 2017, Bill C-48, an act respecting the regulation of vessels that transport crude oil or persistent oil to or from parts or marine installations located along British Columbia's north coast. As witnesses today from the Department of Transport, we have Natasha Raskinen, Jennifer Saru, Emily Galinas, and Joseph Maloshenko. We will do now clause-by-clause consideration. Pursuant to Standing Order 75-1, consideration of Clause 1 short title is postponed. I will now call Clause 2, which is NDP 1. And on to Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah,
yes,
thank you very much. I'll try to be, we only have a certain number of amendments that we deem to be important about C-48. I know my colleague, Madam May, and I think there might be a couple from, or just one from the Liberals as well. So what we sought to do in this, and this is, first of all, part of our amendments came from directly from witness testimony that we heard here at committee in reviewing C-48, the North Coast tanker ban. Part of it is also informed by the, well, more than 10-year-long campaign that has been sought in the riding I represent in northwestern British Columbia, where most of this bill applies, in consultations with First Nations leaders, environmental organizers, and just everyday citizens who have been concerned about the threat of tanker traffic on the North Coast. So what NDP 1, this amendment, does is to add refined oil products to the ban. The nature of what it is that can and cannot be shipped is at the heart of what any sort of tanker moratorium would be. When you get into the specifics over the various materials that are shipped around the world today, you can get into the weeds a bit, if you will, Madam Chair, but we wanted to make sure that we wanted to prevent refined oil spills, because we've seen the incidents of what those can look like. If you'll recall, colleagues, the Nathan E. Stewart, which ran aground and sank outside of Bella Bella just about a year ago. There has been a recent incident just in the news this weekend. So the spills of those refined products, according to many experts who work in the field, can be just as bad or even sometimes worse than what's contemplated under C-48. So we have other amendments to include this that will be subsequent to make the bill whole if NDP 1 were to pass, and I look forward to my colleagues' interventions and support on the amendment.
Okay, I'd like to ask the department if they would like to comment on the implications of NDP 1.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to simply resume once again that the legislation as it stands provides an unprecedented level of environmental protection and is unique, first of its kind in the world. It's a precautionary approach targeting crude and persistent oils and using internationally and science-based definitions for those oils. And the coverage of the legislation is consistent with those international and science-based definitions.
Any further comments or discussions on NDP 1? Mr. Cullen?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just briefly then, I think if I hear Raskinen, I want to pronounce it right, Ms. Raskinen's comment. So to make the promise made of the first part of our official's comment and the government's and the Prime Minister's public declarations true, we believe that the enhancement to this bill of adding refined oil products to the ban would do this. This also, just for those concerned, because we've had some testimony on this around the potential of LNG development and other proposals that exist both on the North Coast and other places. Clearly, this amendment would not affect those proposals, and those proponents have been made aware of that, and I think government officials would confirm that NDP 1 wouldn't affect liquefied natural gas and other proposals that are currently being contemplated with First Nations involvement.
Okay. Seeing any further discussion, all those in favor of NDP 1, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. Clause 2 carry. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Opposed? Carries. Okay, NDP 2, Mr. Cullen.
This is also quite pertinent because of the recent events facing the Heiltsuk Nation this past weekend. This clause seeks to provide an enhancement of oil spill response recovery on the Northwest. If colleagues will recall, just yesterday I was up in the House questioning Minister Garneau about the proposal from the Heiltsuk community, the same community facing the threat from the Nathan E. Stewart and the recent incident this past Sunday, that the ability to actually enforce a moratorium, the ability to properly respond to large events, but also some of the smaller scale events, is directly correlated to the ability of the government physically to put materials into the environment. These are booms, these are tug responses, these are the various things that communities, the Heiltsuk, the Haida, well, the coast in general has been calling for. About a year ago, the government announced its coastal strategy. It's been a year since, and there has not been as much, perhaps, activity on the ground and on the water as people would have liked to have seen. This is simply an enhancement to this legislation to ensure that there is an improvement to the oil spill response in the northwest coast of British Columbia.
Department officials, would you like to comment?
I will just add that the purpose of the legislation is outlined in the title to the bill, and the proposed amendment does not reflect the policy intent of the moratorium. Certainly, the marine safety elements and spill prevention and response capacity is being addressed through the Oceans Protection Plan.
Mr. Collins.
I don't think it's my feedback there, but so what I'm understanding that if a clause like this, 2.1 says, is to encourage and improve oil spill prevention and response in the north coast of British Columbia, does that contravene the intention of C-48? Does it work against the Act as a moratorium on the usage and passage of large marine vessels? I'm wondering if it's harmful, essentially, Chair. Sometimes we have additive amendments. This is deemed in order, so it's not outside of the scope of the bill. I understand the central intent of the bill, but if Clause 2.1 doesn't work against that intent, it only enhances, then I'm wondering what the specific concern might be from our officials or from government members if they're planning, as I suspect, to vote against.
Officials?
I do think there is a scope element here that we are looking at, and the title of the legislation very clearly defines what is the intent of it.
All right. Further discussion. I've got Mr. Hardy. Mr. Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The problem I'd have with the amendment, Mr. Cullen, is that the bill, as it's written, really doesn't get into protecting the ocean. There's no measures and no provisions that sort of leap out and say, well, you know, as a result of this moratorium, thus and so is going to happen with respect to protecting the ocean. So with that material being more or less absent in here, this does seem out of place, and particularly, as was mentioned, with the, if you like, the complementary activities of the Ocean Protection Plan.
Sorry, I've got Mr. Fraser and then Mr. Cullen.
Certainly, thanks, Mr. Cullen, for raising this. Just to build on Mr. Hardy's comments, one of the concerns that I have if we start outlining what the purpose is, which I think this is part of a larger piece to try to improve spill response and prevention, but I think if we say the purpose of this legislation is to achieve that, there's a number of other measures not included in this bill, specifically around cleanup, that I think would not be properly reflected if we actually said the purpose of this is to improve, I forget the precise language you've used, oil spill prevention and response. To me, if we said this is the purpose, we might communicate to Canadians that this legislation doesn't actually achieve its intended purpose, because to achieve what you've stated the purpose maybe should be isn't actually accomplished in my mind by what this legislation is, notwithstanding that I still support the legislation.
Mr. Collins?
Yeah, if I can then, while understanding my colleague's point, this bill is explicitly and nominally to protect the coastal waters of British Columbia. Like, that's the idea. You wouldn't, you wouldn't invoke a moratorium on a certain transport of goods. Well, you could for other reasons, but my assumption all along has been the reason that we're banning and seeking to have a moratorium on these products moving in this way on the coast is the risk that's posed. This is the Prime Minister's declaration. This is the statement that I take for at virtue. If colleagues will also cast forward, we have some amendments that would lower the threshold of certain size of vessels that are also going to be permitted under this, that this hangs with the idea of why we're doing this in the first place. So oil spills will still continue to happen even with the passage of C-48. I feel pretty confident in saying that because we know that there's going to be, whatever size of vessel is going to be allowed to go through. We've seen it just this weekend. We saw it a year ago to this weekend, almost to the date, where spills will continue. Even if C-48 had been in place, these tankers that move, smaller tankers, barges that move through the area will continue. So having spill response seems to me, again, not harmful to the prospects of this legislation. It can do no harm, so why vote against, essentially is my argument. But
okay. Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Yeah, interesting.
All right. Any further questions or discussion? Okay, all those in favor of NDP?
Wouldn't mind to record it on this one, Madam Chair.
Okay, recorded vote. All those in favor, whoops, oh, sorry, this is the clerk can do it. Okay.
So we have a recorded division on NDP 2. Mr. Graham. Mr. Fraser. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Iacono. Mr. Secan. Ms. Wagenthal. Mr. Chung. Mr. Lobb. Mr. Cullen. So, yeas pour 2, nays contre 8. 8.
Does not carry. So shall clause 3 carry? We just had the vote, which is clear.
No. You have to put the question.
Okay, shall clause 3 carry? Please raise your hands. Opposed? Okay. All right. The NDP 3 is inadmissible. Given the fact that under the House of Commons Procedures and Practice, second edition, an amendment to a bill that was referred to committee after second reading is out of order if it is beyond the scope and principle of the bill. And it is the opinion of myself as the chair that the scope of the bill as agreed as second reading is limited to heavy products that break up and dissipate slowly when spilled. Therefore, I rule the amendment inadmissible.
Can I just have, do you mind just some clarification, Chair, if I can, through you to the more for my own edification and understanding why NDP 1 was admissible but 3 not? They both deal with the notion of refined oil products that are not included in C-48. We had deemed these both admissible simply because they were adding a category of products that were contemplated but just simply omitted from the bill.
Scope of the bill to petroleum in any form, including refined products.
Okay.
So it broadens the scope considerably.
Oh, so just if I can understand you then, Chair, and I'm not looking to belabor this point, but NDP 1 was broadening the scope but not so large as to raise concerns. NDP 3, your ruling is that the scope was broadened too far?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
All right, we are then on to PV1. Ms. May, would you like to speak to this?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and forgive me, but I need to put on the record an objection to the process, to the fact that this committee passed a motion that deprives me of the rights I would ordinarily have to present these amendments at report stage. And I know that you individually did not intend to increase my workload, deprive me of my rights, and pass a motion that essentially requires me to be here rather than giving me an opportunity. But I place my objection on the record and move to put forward the amendment which is deemed to have been moved because I have no rights here except for the motion you passed that makes me be here. So I apologize for complaining about the nature of the manipulation. The amendment I'm putting forward deals with the issue of the size of the vessel. And you've certainly heard testimony from West Coast Environmental Law, Pacific Wild, Sierra Club of British Columbia, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, the Haida and the Heiltsuk Nations have questioned the 12,500 metric ton threshold. As you've just heard from our colleague Nathan Cullen, that threshold is far larger than the spill which caused so much damage just recently, within the last year, of the Nathan E. Stewart spill that was a real threat to the Heiltsuk community and nation. We're looking at here the evidence of Transport Canada's report that in order to provide resupply shipments to the North Coast, vessels of 3,200 metric tons is an appropriate limit on the size of the vessel. I do want to say that, by the way, I overall welcome C-48. Just to give a tiny bit of history, this bill essentially does what we had in place since 1972 through a voluntary moratorium on the shipment on the north coast of BC that the federal government and the British Columbia government had accepted until the recent Conservative government. So legislating the North Coast tanker ban is welcome. I'll make other efforts to expand it, but overall I certainly welcome this piece of legislation, but would much prefer, as would the communities along the coast, to ensure that the allowable shipments are held to 3,200 metric tons in bulk. So my amendment goes to every place where you see 12,500 metric tons and changes it in each location to 3,200 metric tons. Thank you.
Okay, would the department like to comment on PB1, please?
Well, please say that the oil tanker moratorium was designed to not interfere and affect resupply to communities and local industries in northern British Columbia, and to minimize economic impacts on these communities and industries. Critical access is needed. Based on significant engagement, based on a study that was just referred to, 12,500 metric tons is the appropriate threshold to not affect resupply at both the community and industry level.
Thank you. Okay, questions? Mr. Cullen?
So to our department officials, because I don't claim expertise in the varying size of ships, we checked, because we're predominantly talking about First Nations communities, coastal communities, in their effort to resupply. Some of them still run on diesel generation. But we weren't able to find any communities that use vessels in excess of 3,200 tons, that their resupply shipments came in vessels much smaller than that. So that was part of, I mean, I have an amendment coming that's even more restrictive, but I don't, do you have any evidence of communities that use vessels in the scale of 12,500 tons? Many of these communities are of 100 to 300 people. I've never heard of a vessel of that size coming in to resupply a coastal community like Hartley Bay. That would be extraordinarily large.
Some of this, you're right, some of the smaller communities do have smaller levels. For industry resupply, there are some larger ones.
Okay, then if I may, Madam Chair, can the department officials indicate, because I also know most of the larger industries on the North Coast, which industries came forward that use vessels in excess of 3,200 tons for their resupply?
So it's not a specific industry. I mean, there are a number of industries, as you know. There's aluminum, there's forest, pulp and paper, there's fishing. What happens is that there are small tankers, usually that they range, but I mean small tankers that will carry a mix of persistent and non-persistent oil. Okay. And based on a study and research on those volumes, as well as talking to those industries, it was deemed that the 12,500 metric ton was the appropriate.
If I may, is that the study that Ms. May and Ms. Gannon made?
It's the study that's public on the Transport Canada website.
It's an interesting thing, because we looked around for, is that the same study, Ms. Sykes? Yeah. We looked around for, there isn't pulp and paper anymore. So we looked around for industries that were calling for that specific. We looked at Rio Tinto. We looked at the major likely folks, and we couldn't find anybody that said that they move shipments in. And is it the mix of persistent, non-persistence that's the problem? Because we're only looking and trying to limit one category, not the other.
That's correct. So on a tanker, you could have that tanker with multiple holds, and in several of the holds it will be non-persistent, whereas other holds will have persistent oil. And the maximum, while a tanker could hold, for example, 23,000 metric tons of oil, it may only hold 11,000 metric tons of persistent oil. So based on a study and research and discussions with industry, as well as the more comprehensive study that we did, that's how we arrived at the 12,000.
And so the more comprehensive one is also the one that you, Ms.
So what we have
Raskin,
shared, as well as discussions, so we did have obviously meetings and discussions with industry, and looked at evidence of actual shipments that have happened over the last 5 years.
And that's the one you've made public? That more extensive study. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ken?
I certainly wouldn't accuse Ms. May of being Pollyanna, because the whole reason we're here is to actually protect the environment. But at the same time, we can't impede commerce. But I guess the question I wanted to ask was, is it reasonable to assume that the volume that's restricted could be increased once communities are more self-sufficient? Perhaps when technology improves, is it increased? At the moment, I can't see how 12, we were given a reason of why it's 12,500. Ms. May was asking for it to be extended to 3,200 metric tons. Reduced, sorry. Right, I see what you're saying. So in the future, is it reasonable to believe, see that how it could be further reduced from 12,500?
I think if there were to be changes contemplated to this, it would have to be a legislative amendment based on actual volumes that are being shipped at that time. So further study would have to be done to determine if that's reasonable.
Any further comment or discussion? If PB1, oops, I'm sorry, Mr. Locke?
Just for clarification to the department, is that 13,000 or 12,500? Is that around 5 million liters? Is that the numbers we're talking about?
I'm not sure I can answer that question readily.
2,000 kilograms of tons.
My colleague may be able to pull it out.
How big in liters?
1,000 kilograms of metric ton. So 1,000, yeah, 1,000 liters.
Oil is lighter than water, but that's water at 4 degrees Celsius.
What about at 6?
Discussion. We'll hold on until we get a sufficient answer from the officials. In liters?
Yeah. You were asking in liters?
So 1,000 liters is 0.73 metric tons. Yes, right.
Just doing the math.
I mean, I think.
Calculation right now because we have the formula but not the amount.
is it Mr. Lobb? Would it?
By 1.5 to get roughly.
Oh, okay. I think we have a
liters
tentative answer.
20 oil, which was roughly.
Go ahead.
So based just on a quick check here, it should be approximately 13 to 14 million liters. I mean, the density varies on different products, but it should be approximately that.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciated that fast math on the run.
Follow-up question then,
course,
because that
Mr.
is,
Locke.
I mean, we knew it was going to be a big number, and so I'm just curious then, from the study that you're citing, is the idea then that this vessel would fuel several communities in one trip, or is this point to point? Like, is there communities that are actually requesting 14 or 15 million liters at one time?
No, the threshold would limit the total on a vessel to 12,500 metric tons of the prohibited products. So crude oil or persistent oil that is listed in the schedule could not be higher in total on a vessel than 12,500. There may be occasions where communities are visited sequentially, but and a total amount of product dropped off so that it diminishes. But at its starting point, wherever it lands first, it cannot exceed the threshold set in the legislation.
Okay, and so in the studies that you did on a trip from point A to finish, what are the average size shipments? Like, not just in one stop, but what they
Right.
would consider an entire trip. Like,
But
what would
that
a good average
depends.
be?
There are different types of ships that are used for various elements of community resupply and industry resupply. So it depends on the vessel. It depends on how many stops it has. It could be smaller. It could be up to 12,500 max.
So there were cases where, like in your study, where there was 12,500 delivered?
Close to there, yeah.
Mr. Locke?
Not at this time.
Thank you. All right, not seeing any further questions or comments. For the information of the committee, if we adopt PV1, NDP4 would not be able to be moved as there would be a line conflict. So, all those in favor of PV1, which is, okay, right, all those in favor, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. On to NDP4. Okay, NDP4, Mr. Collin?
Yeah, I'm still, I need to go back to some of my community leaders and find out who's received a ship with 13 million liters of anything on it. That's news to me. I'm trying to imagine the scenario. So NDP 4, I believe, is the essentially the same in scope as Madam May's motion, but slightly more restrictive. So just to give people some context, for those that don't know, our restriction is still allowing vessels 4 times the size of the Nathan E. Stewart that sank off of Bella. So anybody worried about commerce and trade, you could run 4 Nathan E. Stewarts of size as to what ran aground and caused trouble in Bella and still be under the limit that we've set. So the limit the government's proposing is even 6 times more than that, which is a lot. But I can see the trend of things, Chair. It doesn't seem like amendments are got much of a life today, but I'll move it as is.
Would the department like to comment on NDP4?
I think the conversation we just had covers it.
Okay, fine. Any further discussion or comment, Mr. Hardy?
Just quickly, one of the issues that came up during the discussion when we were working through the bill and the witnesses was the matter of whether or not one ship could service a number of different communities on one trip. rather than increase kind of the exposure and the risk by having too much back and forth, which was one of the rationale for even the 3,200 limit. So to reduce that even further, my speculation at least is that you'd be increasing the number of longer distance trips with this product on board, which would only increase the risk then of something happening.
If I can respond briefly, but these are the exact conversations I had with folks who live in those communities, run the power stations. They signed off on this proposal. So there isn't a notion, even at 3,200 or 2,000 tons, that it would require ships to go and come from port to service the mid-coast and north coast communities. We checked that. So with the people who deal with these ships and have dealt with these ships for many years, they were very comfortable with the amendments that we're removing. I'm talking about the Gitgat and Hartley Bay, the Kitasoo, the Haida, all supported the amendments that we put forward. So I rely on the people who deal with these products, and they would never seek to put their communities in any increased harm way. They're supportive of the broad legislation. They just wanted to see it tightened up a bit because the loopholes are still too big.
All right. Okay. NDP 4. Shall NDP 4 carry? All those in favor, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. PB 2, Ms. May, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I would, and I apologize to colleagues around the table. I'll be in and out due to the debates on C-63. But I'm fairly certain that this motion, this amendment that I want to bring forward, I'll just say that the purpose of this amendment is to extend this moratorium to the whole coast of British Columbia and not just the north coast. I'm expecting this to be ruled as beyond the scope of the bill, but it was strongly recommended by the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs that this extend to all sensitive marine areas of our coastline, and therefore I wanted to, in principle, bring it forward, and I accept the chair's ruling when it inevitably will come.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us. Just to ratify, it is inadmissible, and I'll read out the rationale as you've just said. Bill C-48 formalizes a crude oil tanker moratorium on the north coast of British Columbia. The amendment seeks to extend the application of the bill to the entire coast of British Columbia. So it is my opinion as the chair that the scope of the bill as agreed at second reading is limited to British Columbia's north coast. And so the amendment is out of order. And consequential amendment PB6 is also inadmissible. So it's in. Clause 4 carry. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. All those in favor of Clause 4. Okay. We're in favor of Clause 4. Yes, well, I tried to. I'm not sure we had everybody's attention. Right? Shall Clause 4 carry? Opposed? Okay. Okay. Shall Clause 5, we have no discussion. Shall Clause 5 carry? All those in favor of Clause 5? Opposed? Carried. Okay. NDP 5. Mr. Cullen?
Yeah. So one of the concerns we raised with the minister and others is the notion of exemptions. They, in response to questions, there doesn't feel like there's a clear and public way in which exemptions for the moratorium not to apply have been described yet. That the ministerial prerogative in this is very, very strong, too strong, I would argue, that the broad powers in the bill could be used in future. Whenever government's designing legislation, there's a tendency, temptation, to imagine only the government who is designing the legislation applying the legislation. But of course, as we know, when we write laws, various governments will apply them or not. And so the concern was not so much a to try to discredit our good transport minister, who's doing a fine job, is to have this thing be airtight. So if we intend a moratorium, then have the moratorium and not allow for exemptions. The one notion that was brought forward is any sort of an emergency that we would want to exempt an oil tanker of some large scale beyond 12,500 tons. I can imagine no such emergency in which a community would suddenly cry out for a super tanker to come in the middle of the night and save them from anything. It's just not imaginable. It's actually be the opposite that we would worry about. So we want to limit those powers, not just, of course, of this minister, but of the way the bill applies in future.
Thank you. Department officials, would you like to comment?
I will simply say that exemption powers are commonly used across various legislation, and I'm certainly not aware of any abuses of them. We've tried to look at that. They are narrowly constrained, and one of the examples that we thought of, and I will just give it back as a possibility, if there were actually an earthquake in Vancouver, at the port of Vancouver, and tankers landing there couldn't land, there could be an option to send a tanker to Prince Rupert, perhaps, if the scale of an earthquake was such that both Seattle and Vancouver were affected. So that is a possible emergency example that one could conceive of.
I understand the challenge in scenario making. That
Sure.
scenario, there'd be nowhere for the oil to go when it got to Prince Rupert because there isn't a pipeline to take it anywhere. It would be safe harbor transport, that type of thing. Alaska would be, and San Francisco and Los Angeles would be obviously much better suited than a port that can't handle a supertanker. But again, just so committee members are aware, there are provisions in the Act already that allow for national defense exemptions and other emergency exemptions. What we're concerned about is that the way the exemptions are written right now, there isn't public disclosure of those exemptions. They're not cited in or gazetted. So one could easily, I can give you a scenario in which a tanker is exempted. The reasons aren't made public or justified or needed to be justified. The minister simply, as the Act is written right now, can get notification of a tanker that would like to land and exempt it. And that's it. And that, to me, runs, I would say, contrary to the spirit of what a North Coast moratorium on supertankers would look like. Why use it if there's other aspects of the Act that allow for national defense and emergency to override the moratorium in some sort of imagined crisis in which earthquakes and tsunamis have hit the West Coast?
Mr. Fraser and then Mr. Hardy.
Thank you very much. Just in response, I think there's sort of two separate issues that you've raised in that last intervention, Nathan. The first dealing with the appropriateness of an exemption at all. The second about the lack of protections against misuse and the possibility that it's used in secret. On the first one, I do accept that there are some circumstances where it could be possible where a public interest exemption may be well placed. I appreciate that you likely disagree or consider that it's dealt with elsewhere in the legislation. I do have an issue with the current draft, and I do intend to be moving an amendment subsequently that hopefully will help quell the second concern. I really do have some issues around the use of a public interest exemption with no transparency, no release to the public of why you're doing it or the fact that you're doing it. I hope the amendment I propose will achieve this. And in a general sense, I appreciate a public interest flexibility in a number of different pieces of legislation, so long as the public is aware of its being exercised.
Mr. Hardy?
In sidebar conversations, I too have expressed some reservations over this, and staff, you mentioned that there's kind of a granularity to how the exemptions would be applied, but I don't see it here. I don't see it in the bill, and so I understand it's a per ship exemption. Where is that? Where can we, in the interests of transparency, really understand the metrics around the exemptions as they might be applied?
Right in Clause 6, it's very clear that a minister may, by order, exempt an identified oil tanker. That is very clear in legal terms, and we've got our lawyer here as well, that that's per vessel. So by individual vessel. And the intent is that, typically exemptions have to be documented, and if there ever were a legal challenge, it is in the intent of a particular vessel meeting the exemption test, being within the spirit of the legislation, and would need to withstand court scrutiny. So the exemptions are designed that way and are used legally that way.
Would there be complementary requirements for, a ship that is given an exemption to be, I don't know, registered with the Coast Guard for passage, or registered in, say, the port of Prince Rupert as a ship in port? Are there other things that would add to the level of transparency?
Right. Well, it is meant to be an exemption for unforeseen circumstances that need to be dealt with in the best interest of Canadians in a fairly quick manner. And so the clause as written specifies that the terms would be determined as appropriate based on the context. And this is what the exemption power provides. So the answer to your question is yes, but it would be context specific.
Any further questions or comments? All those in favor of NDP 5, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. PV 3 is deemed moved by Ms. May. Would anyone like to speak to PV 3 on behalf of Ms. May?
I would never truly endeavor to speak on behalf of Ms. May, other than to say I think this falls into the same reference conversation we just had.
Yeah. Thank you. All those in favor of PV 3, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. Okay. NDP 6, Mr. Collins.
Sense to sort of shore up, if I can use the term, the government's assurance as to if we imagine the scenario an exemption is made, a supertanker has been allowed through. What this would do is put a time limit on the exemption, so there couldn't be a rolling, because yes, it is ship by ship, but if it's done in private and secret, you can just start exempting ships. And again, this is not to cause discomfort for the current government, but one could imagine a moratorium that you can just poke a hole through just by exempting a bunch of ships. It also requires a public review of the exemption following the exemption, so that there is a review of why it was done, did it meet the test, rather than having to go through any legal proceeding, where their concern often is that advice to administer can be deemed non-admissible in court. Someone comes forward and gives advice to a transport minister in future and says, we're exempting these following ships. We no longer have access to information over that advice given, and it is very difficult, as has been proven many times, as the chair would know, to pull any of that evidence forward in a court of law because it is deemed as privilege of Parliament.
Department like to comment?
I will just add, consistent with the comments I just made, that the period for the application of the exemption would be specified, again, context specific.
Mr. Fraser?
Mr. Cullen's comments specifically around, there's no offense taken about the reputation of one minister or another. I think in the long term, the potential harm I see with the misuse of the exemption power is that a minister 30 years from now may say it's in the public interest to have crude shipments coming in out purely because of the economics of it. I think that the kind of circumstances where I think the appropriate use of an exemption would likely extend far beyond 1 month. If I'm talking about the kind of circumstances where there is an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever it might be, I'm thinking specifically in Japan, the Fukushima disaster. This is a multi-year thing, and the timeline I have some reservations about. The other issue I have with, although I appreciate the spirit of it with having it published in the Gazette, I think that's helpful for people who watch the file very closely. If I think, and I've got 2 coasts in my own riding, and the spirit of this bill is very important to me. Nobody back home is watching the Canada Gazette, I believe it or not. I think if there was a broader exercise in publishing this to a more readily accessible source, it might be more appropriate. I don't know if members have had the opportunity to look at the amendment that I intend to bring up to deal with this, but I hope it achieves the spirit of what Mr. Cullen's aiming at, and I hope he appreciates that we're not just shooting it down for the sake of being difficult.
Mr. Hardy.
Yeah, I mean, I share the concerns about transparency, and it's here where, personally, I would like to rely on the fact that there are many eyes on the coast, you know, many eyes in those communities. They will notice if something big is coming through, and coming through on a regular fashion, and it will come to the notice of the public, the legislators, the media, etc. So yes, I would say that that's probably far more efficient and effective than putting something in the Canada Gazette.
Right. Not seeing any further discussion. All those in favor of NDP 6, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. Okay. NDP 7. Mr. Cullen.
I'll speak to this quickly. My friend will be subbing me in a moment. This is to, I know not everybody reads the Canada Gazette, which I see as shameful. You know, I think it should be required reading. When I'm trying to put my 7-year-old twins to bed, I always give them the Canada Gazette, and it's amazing how it just knocks them right out. But this is in the efforts of transparency. So this is deemed, again, once an exemption has been made, that this is putting Statutory Instruments Act, that's the way we went through it this time, to just tell Canadians that it happened. And I know there may be many eyes on the coast and people watching, but it's kind of sort of not the point, right? Like that if a government's okay making a decision, a government should also be okay making that decision public. And the vehicle we do have, as uncaptivating as it is the Canada Gazette. That is the way that the government tells the Canadian people something's happened, orders in council and whatnot.
Would the department have anything new to offer on NDP 7?
Well, just a clarification that the Statutory Instruments Act is deemed not to apply in this legislation because its requirements would not allow quick and timely possibility for an exemption within the way that this exemption is suggested, so that unforeseen circumstances could be dealt with quickly.
Mr. Hardy.
To staff, do you foresee, some supporting regulations coming along to, to accompany this bill? Because, again, in the interest of transparency, in the interests of, in fact, guarding against the future misuse of what is fairly broad discretion by the minister, is it possible that regulation could actually be more prescriptive in terms of what must be done when a minister exercises this discretion?
So I just wanted to clarify that the exemption from the Statutory Instruments Act only applies to the Clause 6, the exemption clause. It does not apply to the entire legislation. So it allows for an exemption clause to be exercised. And we believe that's sufficient in that case.
But it's specifically to Clause 6 that I am referring.
Right.
And my question, or even make it a suggestion if you like, is that in regulation something be put in there that requires a certain level of transparency so that the minister is required to let the public know when this is happening and the reasons for it. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm asking, is that possible outside this piece of legislation?
I'm not able to answer that question. I think transparency is being suggested through other amendments that are coming up.
No further discussion on NDP 7. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. NDP 8. Mr. McGregor, would you like to move that? Would you like to speak to it?
I would, Chair, and thank you very much for recognizing me, and glad to see my colleagues dropping in like this. You know, I just had a quick conversation with my colleague, Mr. Cullen, and it appears to me that all of our amendments with this bill are an effort to increase a little bit of public scrutiny. And, you know, on a personal note, as a coastal British Columbian, a proud Vancouver Islander, I know that Mr. Cullen and his colleague, Mr. Donnelly, both coastal British Columbians, they do have the interests of our communities at heart. And I sincerely hope my colleagues will see the wisdom in these amendments and give them some great consideration and offer their support for them. So I so move the amendment, Madam Chair.
Would the officials like to speak to NDP 8? All right. Any questions or discussion? All those in favor of NDP 8, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. Okay. The next is G1. Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and perhaps for the benefit of Mr. McGregor, who came in partway through today's meeting, some of the aims of the last few amendments, or the purposes of the last few amendments, I hope to achieve with this amendment. I explained to Mr. Cullen that I shared some of his reservations about the exercise of an exemption power without some opportunity for the public to scrutinize the use of that power. I think it's an important suggestion. Where we differed was only on the mechanism to achieve that. I had some reservations around the Statutory Instruments Act only because of the timeline with which it could preclude the use of that power in an urgent situation. The proposed amendment would add a third subsection that would require the minister to make accessible to the public on the internet or by other means the use of the public interest exemption so that they're not operating in secrecy is really the intent of this proposed amendment.
Thank you. Right, any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor of G1 is moved by Mr. Fraser. Please raise your hands. Opposed? Carries. All right, shall Clause 6 carry as amended? All those in favor? Clause 6 as amended. Opposed? Carried.
Point of order.
Yes, sir.
Chair.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we can, after we consider Clause 7, if we can group Clauses 8 through 23 together as a single vote.
Yes. Thank you for that suggestion. Oh, I need unanimous consent to do all clauses from 8 to 23 when we get there. All right, thank you. All right, we are now on to PV4. Would the department like to comment on PV4?
We've covered it already.
Thank you. Any comments, questions? All those in favor of PV4, please raise your hands. Opposed? Okay, does not carry. NDP 9. Mr. McGregor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So it's pretty clear what our amendment here is trying to do. You know, in Clause 7 that we're replacing line 12 on page 4 with the following, and it's basically changing the maximum carrying capacity. So I have notes on here that there was a first amendment that was required. So is this still in order? Like, that's just a technical question?
Yes, I'm advised it is.
Okay. So I so move the amendment, Madam Chair. I'll leave it at that.
Would the department like to comment? No comment? Questions? All those in favor of NDP 9? Opposed? Does not carry. Shall Clause 7 carry? Please raise your hand. Shall Clause 7 carry? Opposed? Okay, Clause 7 carried. Now, we will go from Clause 8 to Clause 23. Okay. discussions? Okay, all those in favor of clauses 8 down to clause 23? Mr. Fraser? No,
I thought you were calling a vote.
All those in favor of clauses 8 to 23, please raise your hands. Opposed? Carried. Okay, next is PB5. Right in time, Ms. May.
Sorry for being out, and sorry for missing one of my amendments. This is a pretty straightforward amendment in seeking greater public access to the information and the documents that are referred to in the Act. This would empower the Cabinet to make the regulations that would regard proactive disclosure of reporting and enforcement information and ensure that there's adequate time to consider and address issues. This was brought up in testimony that I think members will recall from West Coast Environmental Law and the Heiltsuk Nation. So access to information is the goal of my Amendment 5, which amends Clause 24 on page 14. So I'm happy to answer any questions about why I've brought this forward, but it is based on evidence you've heard.
Would the department like to comment?
Well, I will just say that the way the clause is written, the Governor and Council may, by regulation, amend the schedule. The regulatory process under the Governor and Council does include transparency and consultation and is part of that process. So it is not going, that process would indeed be followed.
Mr. Fraser?
Yeah, thank you very much, and Ms. May, I appreciate the amendment. Just a couple of questions. Just by way of background, I spent a little bit of time previously in my career working for a human rights organization that focused on access to information laws, and it escapes me how the permissive ability to make regulations about access to information under this legislation would not be redundant, given that it would likely, our existing access to information legislation would apply, and if we make amendments to the schedule, for example, it would follow the regulatory process and all would be public with a period of consultation as well. So I appreciate the spirit of it, but when I look at it, it appears to not necessarily add something to the public disclosure process.
Well, if I may, our new access to information laws, C-58, do move towards proactive disclosure of certain things, but don't touch on this at all. And my effort was to ensure that since we have the regulation-making powers of the Governor and Council under this particular Act in Section 24, at this point, the only thing the Governor and Council is empowered to do by regulation is to amend the schedule by adding or deleting any oil or class of oils. In order to expand that to ensure that the Governor and Council can make regulations to facilitate public access to information, I think this is very, very, very helpful. Now, I know we're looking at C-48 and not C-58, but I'm of the view of the Information Commissioner that Bill C-58 is legislation that takes us backwards and will make it harder to access information. So anything we can do under this bill to make it easier for the public and First Nations communities to have access to that information proactively is certainly, there's no harm in this motion, and I think you could ask your officials, does it do any damage? You can keep your fingers crossed and hope the public's going to be able to get at it, but I've said for years, it's a good line, so I'll say it again, Canada's access to Freedom of Information Acts have tended for years to be freedom from information. I don't think they're getting better, so anything we can do in this bill to create more access to the information that First Nations have wanted on a timely basis, that environmental law groups have wanted on a timely basis, I can't see, and maybe the officials could tell me how it does any harm. The most I've heard them say so far is we don't need it because it's redundant, and that's not something I believe. Thank you.
Mr. Fraser?
Perhaps I think we've got council at the table, if I'm not mistaken. Does the proposed amendment add any new protections to the public's access to information?
Thanks. Well, there's no
there's no substantive protections in the proposed amendment. It's a proposed power to make regulations about access to information. What's left unclear about this amendment is how that would differ from the existing scheme in the Access to Information Act, and how new rules could apply in the event of a conflict with that act, which would supersede these regulations.
All right, not seeing any further discussion. All those in favor of PB5, please raise your hand. All those in favor of PB5? Opposed? Does not carry. NDP 10, Mr. McGregor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So if I can direct the committee's attention to clause 24, where it does state the governor and council may by regulation amend the schedule by adding or deleting any oil or class of oils. Now, I'm sure my Liberal colleagues will agree with me that their government's mantra is openness, accountability, and transparency. And I think it's fairly critical in respecting that vision of government that we amend this section so that if the minister decided that a particular fuel type was to be removed from the ban, that that minister in question would make a sustained effort, allowing whatever measure he or she wants to inform the public of why that particular fuel type is being removed. Now, if we look at the different classes of fuel that can be transported over our waters, we know they behave differently based on what their chemical makeup is, and they behave differently in water. And I think that the residents of coastal communities should have that reasoning from the government, that public notice that this particular fuel type is going to be removed from the ban. And I believe that this fits very well in the spirit of the Liberal government's attempts to be open, transparent, and accountable. And I hope my arguments are enough to bring my Liberal colleagues on board to sustain this amendment. And with that, Madam Chair, I move the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Department officials?
To add a explanation, kind of elaborating what I said earlier, that the regulatory process that is proposed here is the standard regulatory process that requires quite a bit of transparency, publication of proposed amendments in Canada Gazette, consultation, prescribed consultation process before any changes are approved, and in fact it would be subject to the Statutory Instruments Act. So all those elements are already in the clause.
Mr. Fraser?
Just my understanding, I might request just a 30-second huddle here. I appreciate the spirit of it. I think as was just explained, when there's a change made to the schedule right now, it is published through the Gazette and is made public. If you wouldn't mind just giving us 30 seconds just to chat it over, that might be helpful for members on the side of the table.
I will suspend for a moment or two.
We get the expert at the table.
Mr. Fraser?
Look, after just a quick conversation, one of the things that I wanted to confirm was that the spirit of it, I get that it is public through the Gazette, but the additional process through the existing measure requires a open public consultation as well, which I think might actually increase the transparency rather than just saying sort of the minister can notify the public in any manner they deem appropriate. So I sincerely appreciate the motivation behind it and agree with it. But I think on the process, the ordinary regulatory process might give more protection than the proposed amendment is my opinion on this one.
Mr. Secan?
Just to add to that, you missed it, but your colleague, Mr. Collin, had a jovial way of saying this himself, and he actually stated that we inform the public through the Gazette as well.
Any further discussion on NDP 10? Okay, all those in favor? Yes,
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, your points are well taken. I mean, I think, and with respect to the department, you know, Mr. Cullen did make reference to reading the Gazette to his children to aid in them going to sleep. What I've found in my experience, because I have previously worked for a member of parliament, and so I have a fairly long history in dealing with the federal bureaucracy. They are all fantastic people, but sometimes they and civil society organizations are guilty of working in silos, and sometimes the information is made known to stakeholders, but not to the general public. And I think by codifying the requirement, we add that kind of certainty to this process. But I'll end on that, Madam Chair, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. All those in favor of NDP 10, please raise your hands. Opposed? Does not carry. Shall Clause 24 carry? Please raise your hands if you support Clause 24. Opposed? Okay, it carries. Okay.
Madam Chair, point of order.
Yes, Mr. Chong.
Can you seek the unanimous consent of the committee to group clauses 25 through 31 inclusive together as a single vote?
Do we have unanimous consent to group them 25 to 31? We have unanimous consent. Thank you very much. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Chong. Shall clauses 25 to 31 carry? Carried. Okay. Now we have Schedule 1. Shall the Schedule 1 carry? Just a second. Shall Schedule 1 carry? All those in favor? Yes, it carries. The short title, shall Clause 1 carry, which is the short title? All those in favor? Opposed? Carries. Okay, PVC.
So we go to the title directly.
Yeah. Shall the title carry? Opposed? It carries. Shall the bill carry? As amended? Opposed? Okay. It carries. On division. Shall I report the bill as amended to the House? Opposed? On division. Okay. And shall the committee order a reprint of the bill? All those in favor, shall the committee order a reprint? Yes. Okay. All right. Anything else? Great job, everybody. Thank you very much. Just before we adjourn, our meetings will be Mondays and Wednesdays in our next segment coming in the end of January. And on Thursday, we will be dealing with the Mr. Bertina's water quality motion and Bill C-344 at the same meeting, and anything else that we can add to that meeting. All right, thank you. I'll move adjournment. Thank you to departmental staff for coming and for all of your assistance. Move adjournment.